Starting in Maya, I changed my scene scale to feet and then made a unit-sized cube. After moving the cube's origin point to a bottom corner, I was able to snap it to the grid and then move it out of the way. Duplicating this cube and snapping it to one unit up and then duplicating it again gives a perfect 3-foot tall tower. I then used this tower to scale another cube to be the basic shape of my gravestone, standing at about 2.5 feet tall. Now the scale was set, it was time to start shaping. Selecting both top corner edges, I applied a bevel to round the corners, making sure to add as few sections as possible without the shape being too gadget. Once that was done, I selected both the front and back face and used the extrusion tool to inset the faces. I don't extrude them inward here, even though I want an indent, because I plan to fake the indent with height maps. Instead, it's time to divide those faces up so they're made of quads instead of a single end-on. For most of the divisions, I just connected the two vertices on either side of the front and back faces, but once I got to the top, I instead decided to put an edge loop down the middle so I wouldn't be stuck with any triangular faces. Now that my shape is how I want it, I freeze all transformations and delete history so I can move on to UV mapping. Since the basic cube UV is no longer usable, I select all the edges and sew them together. I do this instead of deleting the UVs because then I can move to my 3D workspace and make cuts exactly where I want them before selecting everything and unwrapping. This saves me time trying to unwrap each section one at a time, and it means I won't miss any faces. Once my UV shells are unwrapped and laid out, I'll do a quick check to see if there's any squashing or warping. With that done, it's time to move to Substance Painter. After importing my model and generating some maps to paint on, I immediately noticed that my idea to make the gravestone indent through the height map isn't viable. I set my map resolution to 512 because this gravestone is meant to be a video game asset, so I want to save on memory if I can. At this resolution, the indent is very pixelated. Rather than scale up my height map immediately, I instead decide to just head right back to Maya and inset the faces in the geometry. To do this, I first select the two UV shells that make up this area, then switch to face select so I can use the extrude tool. Setting the local translate Z field lets me extrude straight into my object, which works on both sides simultaneously. With a few edits to my UVs, it's back to Substance Painter. I start off with the writing on the front. I want the letters to pop out, so I search for a font I like and then drag it to the UV side of my screen. Working on this side makes it easier to center the text as I work. With my inscription added, I decided to add some little decorative symbols using this symbol font. The symbol here appears when you type lowercase z. Unfortunately, unlike some of the other symbols, this one doesn't have a mirrored variant. So once I have it placed on one side, I duplicate the layer and set one of the scale values to be the inverse of what it was, or in this case, positive instead of negative. To get the rotation right, I changed the value of the copy's rotation 10 degrees at a time until both shapes overlapped equally, then moved it horizontally until it looked about right. When experimenting with the symbol font, I found that lowercase o and p put together make this nifty little symbol, so I went ahead and put that on the top. At this point, I decided that the subtext was too hard to read, so I changed the font to a sort of similar one. Then I decided that I liked the new font much better, so I wrote the name out in it as well. I really didn't like how the capital H looked in this font, so I replaced it with a few spaces and just wrote H in the original font. For some extra flavor, I added some foreboding text on the back in a shallower, more crumbly-looking font, and with that, I was finally ready to actually texture the gravestone. Scrolling through the texture presets, I found this, which reminded me of hardened cement. Using this as my first base color fill, I noticed some issues with how it was automatically mapped across some of the UV shells. So I added a white mask and filled the problematic shells with black, then duplicated the layer and inverted the mask. This lets me change the rotation of just the problematic parts while keeping the rest as it was. Once it just about lined up, I decided to try a different UV projection method, which I liked much better. Then I found a basic rock material and added it over the top, ran it through a grayscale generator, and set the blending mode so I could see both rocky textures at once. For a final touch on the stone, I added a basic fill layer with a nice gray and lowered the opacity. This helped to even out the colors a bit. Finally, I browsed the smart masks and used a few dirt masks to add some, dirt. I just set the material to be a simple brown. I would have used an actual dirt material, but there weren't any in the default packs. With a few healthy layers of earth applied, I finished my texturing by adding some moss in the crevices via smart masks. I tried this moss on the top mask, but I decided it took away from the lettering I spent hours on, so I instead went with the more subtle option of only adding it in the cracks. Because this is also where my dirt masks are the thickest, it actually adds some nice variation to the moss color, which makes it look a lot better than plain green normally does. With that, my gravestone is finally finished, so I export it to Sketchfab, edit the details, and set up the lighting to highlight the letter edges and cast a nice shadow you might see on a sunny day.